Hey everyone. I just read and watched The Shining. I read Stephen King's novel The Shining, and I also watched Stanley Kubrick's The Shining in movie form. And I've got to say, I have a few thoughts about The Shining. First of all, I read the book before watching the movie. The moment I was done with the book, I immediately watched the movie because it was on Netflix. And I've gotta say, I initially felt that the movie version kind of botched the franchise. Well, not the franchise, but the whole concept of The Shining, because there are clear differences between the book Shining and the movie Shining, and today I'm gonna try and talk about these differences and how how each version of The Shining has become a hallmark in each medium. First, to talk about the book Shining, the book has very complex three-dimensional characters. I talked about this in my review of Midsommar. Jack, Wendy, and Danny all have these personality traits and how they bounce off each other that creates an interesting dynamic, especially Jack as his very gradual process into becoming mad, and Wendy, her jealousy towards Danny's love for Jack, and Danny, who is 6 or 7 years old, has the ability to read other people's minds and has to deal with these complex thoughts that even adults can't cope with, especially Jack and Wendy, and how their relationship has been tainted by Jack's alcoholism, his career and how it turned out. All of that is very well built up. I would say about a half to 2/3 of the book is portioned to building up these characters, and it is very scary in a psychological sense when Jack finally does go full psycho at the end, because you really do feel sympathy for the character, but you feel sympathy for these characters and they're fighting for their lives against each other, and you just don't feel very comfortable, and it's scary, and it's actually a really scary book. Not to say that there aren't scary elements in the initial parts where the character building is done. There are very slight little sprinkles of little moments of the impending chaos in the books, that kind of teases the readers to keep them going, because if it was all character development, not a lot of people would keep on reading, but there are these elements of horror that are mixed in between these character developing moments, so the reader can kind of slide through the story gradually. And when it finally gets to full psycho mode, that's when Stephen King releases all of these horrific elements and horror sets that he had in mind, bringing back many different elements that he had set up at the very start of the book and kind of bringing it back together at the end. It was quite satisfying to read, and it was quite investing to read, because I think I took the same amount of time. So I think I took about a few weeks, about 2 weeks, to read 500 pages, the first 500 pages, and the last about 180 pages I read in 2 days. So that's how invested I was near the end of the book. Now, when I watched the movie, I mentioned earlier that I was kind of disappointed, because I think Kubrick kind of ditched trying to set up Jack's character in this three-dimensional manner. I think he did put some lines where you can actually feel for Jack, especially in his argument, in his confrontation of Wendy in his working room. However, the main focus of Jack Torrance's character for Kubrick was that he was always a little bit psycho, and that has to do with Jack Nicholson's performance. And I gotta say, I was very interested in that. Jack Torrance's actor is named Jack Nicholson. Danny Torrance's actor's name is Danny Lloyd, and I kind of wondered if that was kind of factored in the casting. While we're talking about the casting, I also thought it was kind of strange to put Shelley Duvall, I think her name was, as Wendy in the movie version, because in the book she is described to be this very attractive, physically, model-esque blonde female. And here she is more of a helpless-looking, dark-haired, and I would say Shelley Duvall does sell the very scared and terrified look very well. Some people have criticized her for not being able to act, but I think that that her acting was genuine terror that kind of doesn't come out as that can't come out naturally. I mean, no, let me rephrase that. So I think her portrayal of her scared character and the terror she feels, I feel like was so genuine that it's nearly identical to actual terror, not something that's acted. And I really felt, I really could sympathize with this character. Stanley Kubrick's version focuses on a few different elements of horror, especially about the Grady incident. And he kind of sometimes brings up these other elements that Stephen King liked to toy with, especially Stephen King liked to toy with the topiary animals, the hedge animals, except Kubrick changed that to a hedge maze, which I thought was very brilliant. You've got to make some changes from the book when making an adaptation. But first, going back to my thoughts of disappointment about Jack's character, I later realized that it was inevitable because in an compact amount of time of 2 hours, you can't put in 700 pages of character development into a 2-hour movie, which I think Stephen King tried to do with his miniseries and ultimately failed, because there are some things that you can do in a movie and you can't do. And Stanley Kubrick decided to go for the horror route, pure, genuine terror route, and I thought that was a genius move. And there are many techniques that Kubrick uses that is used to this day, such as the opening shot, which was also a little bit in Midsommar. I could tell that it was kind of influenced by Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Everything goes by very quickly in Kubrick's version, which means that sometimes I think viewers could get lost. Because I read the book and then watched the movie, I had a vague idea where everything was going. But if I had no knowledge of the book whatsoever, I will kind of wonder if a viewer would get lost in what's happening at that particular scene. Other than that, I thought I came to appreciate both Kubrick's and Stephen King's versions of The Shining because I think they're both great in their own senses, except that they chose different routes to go when it comes to horror. Stanley Kubrick decided to create a world of imaginary world that Stephen King created, and decided to develop upon that with cinematic techniques to increase the horror a viewer can feel, and he succeeded in that. I actually felt genuine terror while I was watching this movie. And this is a film from 1980s, which means it kind of holds up to this day, nearly 40 years later. Meanwhile, the book kind of goes for a little bit of a psychological route when it comes to its horror. I feel like Stephen King also does a good job in portraying generic horror, such as the ghost or the moving animals or the hose that turns into a snake. But he also makes these horrors scary in the sense that he has constructed such good characters, such characters that feel so real, so much like someone you could actually become in your life later on. And I thought that was very interesting. I thought that's the genius in both of them. They decided to choose different paths in constructing the story. And I think initially they didn't understand each other, but now I think Stephen King does understand that Stanley Kubrick decided to go for another route, another take on the Shining story. So those are my thoughts on The Shining. Before I end, I do want to talk about what makes a good adaptation. I want to keep this brief, but I don't know how to answer this question is what I'm trying to get at. What does make a good adaptation from either a book to a movie or a movie to a book? Does it have to be as faithful to the source material as possible, or can it have its own twist while keeping a little bit faithful to the source material? Or can it tell a new story? I think the go-to answer for a generic no-brainer answer would be it has to be faithful, but I kind of changed my mind on that after watching Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. I believe an adaptation can find its way to express its own words that are different from the source material, and I think Kubrick succeeded in that sense. So I had a blast watching this movie. I had a blast reading the book too. The next book I want to read is I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. I watched this movie when I was young. I didn't know it was initially a book, so I'm really excited to read this first and then watch the movie and then make comparisons as well. So I think that's going to come in the near future because I like talking about comparing these two mediums together. Anyways, if you've listened to it here, thanks for listening or watching, and I'll be back.